Walter White didn't get away with arson because he was smart. He got away with it because 2008 was dumb. The famous red BMW roast at a gas station in Breaking Bad Season 1 was an act of pure, unfiltered spite from Walter White that somehow had no consequences. There was no arrest, no investigation, and not even a quick warning. You might be wondering how a man can set fire to something in broad daylight and get away with it. The answer isn't intelligence or cleverness. It's a security system that was so old-fashioned that it practically invited crime. Welcome to 2008, when video footage of crimes was about as useful as a flip phone in a snowstorm. Let's say there would be cameras. Of course, most gas stations said they had them, but the truth was often much less impressive. If there were cameras, they were probably focused on the cash register, not the pump where Walter set his revenge on fire. The coverage of the outside was at best patchy, and the footage of the inside? Mostly grainy, interlaced analog recordings, stored on a weekly tape rotation system. In other words, by the time someone noticed something was missing, 7 days of coffee buying and soda spills had already erased the tape. And what if, by some miracle, a camera was aimed in the right direction? You shouldn't expect to see much more than a blurry figure that looks like a man in beige. It would have been funny to try to identify them. Even today's HD security cameras often record video that looks like it was shot through a fish tank that was fogged up. Back then, the standard was crappy on purpose to save space. Also, Walter looked like a harmless middle-aged chemistry teacher. Most gas station workers probably didn't even think that he might be the one setting fire to a yuppie's convertible, if they were even paying attention in the first place. This disguise of mediocrity helped him get away with a lot of crimes. Heisenberg's brilliance was always hiding in plain sight, behind khakis and a weak cough. In today's world, every gas station is a high-definition panopticon, and every arsonist runs the risk of becoming a viral video before the fire goes out. But in 2008, there was no digital dragnet. Technology was too basic. People were too busy, and Walter was too boring, at least to the average person. So how did Walter White get away with setting fire to a fancy car in a public place? Easy, because at that time, the world was just bad enough to let him. This moment in Granite State shows that Walter White never cared about his family. In the penultimate episode of Breaking Bad, Granite State, we see Walter White shriveled and stewing in his remote New Hampshire exile, as cancer eats away at what little remains of him. Not just physically, but morally, emotionally, and existentially. His only visitor is Ed Galbraith, a vacuum repairman who also works as a criminal relocation specialist. He brings him chemo and supplies, but more importantly, he brings him a much-needed dose of truth. At one point, Walt, who is always trying to make himself look good, asks Ed if he will make sure the money gets to Walt's family when he dies alone in the prison he built for himself in the snow. Ed says, "If I said yes, would you believe me?" It's a quietly devastating line because it's not a lie and not quite the truth either. It's a mirror that shows a man who has lied to everyone, including himself, for 5 seasons. Some people have kindly seen Ed's answer as a way to gently push Walt to look for a different answer. That's not true. Ed isn't being nice, he's being honest, which is something only someone who has nothing to gain can do. The truth is simple. He wouldn't give that money to you. He wouldn't, of course. Why would he? Ed is a criminal, not a charity. He works on a cash up front, no questions, no favors basis. And Walt, who has been lying, stealing, and killing for years under the weak excuse of doing it for his family, now wants someone else to risk going to federal prison for the sake of sentiment. It would put everything Ed has worked for at risk. A lifetime of staying off the grid on the word of a dying meth kingpin. And for what reason? A pat on the back in the next life? Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould, who created the show, have said that Ed would probably keep the money. Robert Forster, who played Ed with perfect subtlety, said he didn't know. He didn't, of course. The point is that it's not clear. It's not that Ed is mean that makes the moment so sharp. It's that he's practical. And for once, Walt sees himself as he really is. He knows Ed wouldn't give the money away. and he wouldn't either. If their roles were switched, Walt would take that money without thinking. It's this painful self-awareness that finally pushes him back into action. So, the last-ditch show with Gretchen and Elliot. He'll have to use his ego as a weapon one last time if he wants that money to get to his family. The real question isn't if Ed would steal the money. He would, of course. But why he doesn't just kill Walt and be done with it. If there is an answer, it is in the strange moral limbo that the criminals in Breaking Bad live in. Ed won't tell a lie. He won't make promises he can't keep. But he also won't kill Walt while he's sleeping and take the money. He has rules that are strict, selfish, and without morals. Not a code of honor, but a code of self-interest that looks like professionalism. Granite State quietly destroys the idea that criminals are noble. There is no honor here, just a cold calculation of risk and reward. Walt's last plan, which came about because of this, is less about redemption and more about controlling the show. He doesn't trust anyone else to do what he wants. Not Ed, not fate, and definitely not the system. Walter White only believes in Heisenberg in the end. And he's going to die. Lydia doesn't want a relationship. She wants plausible deniability. Lydia Rodarte Quayle is the perfect example of corporate precision, pharmaceutical-grade paranoia, and frozen ambition. She's a character full of contradictions. She's too refined to handle blood, but too greedy to stay away from meth empires. She's emotionally repressed, but fiercely maternal. She's powerful in influence, but always on the verge of a nervous breakdown. So the question comes up, what kind of man could possibly be right for her? Let's get rid of the obvious first. Todd Alquist, with his creepy mix of boyish loyalty and casual sociopathy, is not the answer. Even though he tries really hard to impress her, half puppy dog, half hitman, he's exactly the kind of person Lydia should avoid in her signature stilettos. Todd is too eager, too dangerous, and not emotionally ready. Telling him to just be himself is like giving a toddler a loaded gun and telling them to figure it out. On the other hand, there's the idea of a man like Craig Kettleman, a spineless suburban sycophant who would do anything Lydia asks without asking questions or putting up a fight. Very tempting for sure. There's no denying that a partner who poses no threat and always does what you say is appealing. Lydia does best when she can control everything, preferably from a safe distance with a burner phone. But Craig might be too dangerous too. Lydia is not a woman who wants to tell anyone her secrets, let alone her crimes. She wouldn't even think about having a criminal partner, not because of any moral reasons, but because she thinks she's better than the rest of them. She isn't one of them, even though she runs the logistics of one of the most profitable meth businesses in the Southwest. Lydia cares about how things look. You have to keep up appearances. And criminals, messy, loud, bloody criminals, just don't fit the look. Lydia needs a man who is so far away from her illegal world that he doesn't ask questions. A man who is too easygoing to question her and too unaware to notice the strange changes in her bank account. He should be a kind, boring professional, like a doctor, not the kind that saves lives, but the kind that might quietly hand her a vial of poison that can't be traced back to him. Someone who is helpful, but not scary. There, but not in the way. Of course, you could think about Lydia's past forever. Was she a single mother who was having a hard time making ends meet and was lured by the promise of financial security? Very unlikely. She doesn't seem desperate at all. Lydia didn't get into trouble by accident. She got into it by managing projects. Any problems she talks about are probably just her way of justifying her past actions. And what about love? It's not clear if she's even looking. She might not need a man at all. All she needs is a partner who thinks he's her partner, while she keeps one eye on the exits and the other on the bottom line. The only man who is right for Lydia Rodarte Quayle is one who doesn't know he's already being managed. Someone who thanks her for the chance would be best.
Saul Goodman might be worse than Walter White.
and no one wants to admit it. It's amazing how many people think that charm makes them better than others. For example, Saul Goodman is a con artist, a legal parasite, and a master of sleight of hand. He somehow gets away with being the fun alternative to Walter White in the court of public opinion. It seems that wearing loud suits and telling jokes gives you a moral discount, even if you're quietly allowing every kind of depravity. Let's get rid of the illusion right away. Saul Goodman is not a good person. He used to be a small-time con artist, but now he's a high-end criminal consultant. His whole job is to take advantage of other people's weakest moments. The Slip and Jimmy character isn't just a phase, it's the basis. He is a master manipulator and will twist reality into knots just to make someone look stupid, even if it doesn't help him in any way. That's not smart, it's sick. Howard is a good man who is in the wrong place at the wrong time. Saul's plan to ruin his life was both cruel and pointless. There was no big plan or important reason. It was just a casual sport of killing someone's character. But yes, let's all laugh at the guy who didn't kill anyone. When you compare that to Walter White, the conversation takes a turn for the worse. Walter didn't just mess with things, he destroyed them. He gave a child poison. He planned a pipe bomb killing in a nursing home. His hands were not only dirty, they were wet. Still, there is a twisted idea that Walt's direct violence makes him worse than Saul's cowardly complicity. As if watching from the sidelines, cashing the checks, and outsourcing the bloodshed makes Saul less responsible. No, it doesn't. In a sneaky way, it makes him worse. And let's not forget that Saul wasn't just watching. He was the one who made it possible. The person who fixes things. The person behind the curtain. He said to kill Badger. He brought up the idea of killing Jesse. He gave Walt problem solutions with clinical detachment, but only if someone else pulled the trigger. But don't worry, he didn't mean to hurt anyone. He was washing money and morals at the same time. The defense often relies on small details. Saul had no idea that the child had been poisoned. He didn't kill anyone himself. Well, good for him. He hires other people to do his terrible things. It's like mob violence for white-collar workers. Morally empty, but legally protected. Walter was a lot of things. Selfish, insecure, and terrible. But at least he was honest about how he was going down. Saul, on the other hand, hid his evil behind jokes and plausible deniability, always staying just far enough away to deny the effects he caused. Is there a good person in this story? Maybe Flynn. Holly might be it. Everyone else is playing chess on a board that is morally wrong. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of evil to say that Saul Goodman is less bad than Walter White because he didn't pull the trigger himself. Walter ruined lives in plain sight. Saul made money by helping people do it behind closed doors and then charging them by the hour. So no, Saul isn't worse than Walter. He is just as bad, but in a different way. Not as obviously bloody, but still very damaging. You don't need a gun to make someone's life miserable. A smile, a contract, and the right loophole can sometimes be all you need. Walter White poisoned a child, but Skyler is the bad guy. In a world full of moral decay, violence, and egos the size of Albuquerque itself, picking the most hated character in Breaking Bad and its extended family, Better Call Saul, of course, becomes less about who is the worst and more about why people get so angry at certain characters in such specific and revealing ways. Let's start with the most obvious candidates. Uncle Jack and his happy group of neo-Nazi caricatures. Jack Welker isn't really a character. He's more of a plot device. He's a cartoon villain who shows up in the last act to remind us that Walter White still has some soul left to burn. Jack is pure evil. He kills children, steals empires, and kills the people who built them. No one on Earth is saying Jack is their favorite character, and they shouldn't. He is meant to be hated, and he does. Then there's Todd, the smiling sociopath, who is even more disturbing because he hides his evil behind a polite, almost cheerful face. But once again, the hate he inspires is clear. These characters are bad in writing and bad on screen. It's clear and simple. But that brings us to Skyler White, whose place in the fandom's firing line is much more confusing, and to be honest, revealing. People don't hate Skyler because she's bad. They hate her because she dares to go against the fantasy. She is the thing that won't move in Walter White's tragically compelling fall. For a lot of people, she is the one thing they just can't forgive. Being real. Skyler doesn't support Walter's drug empire. She doesn't let him have his way or make excuses for his crimes with a wink. In her situation, she does what any reasonable person would do. She struggles with it, fights it, and sometimes gives into it. But she won't make it sound romantic. And for that, she was hated. Not because she was the worst character, but because she was the most annoying one. Anna Gunn once said with maddening accuracy that Skyler wasn't hated for who she was, but because she got in the way of the story people wanted to believe. Walter White was a man who had been wronged. He was made fun of by students, made to feel less than a man at work, lost his legacy, got cancer, and had a son with disabilities. He was a dream of rebellion that made sense, the modern man's Nietzschean nightmare. And there Skyler was, asking stupid questions like, "What are you doing? Why are you lying? Why do you have a second cell phone?" Compare her to the others. Jesse, the lovable loser. Marie, the compulsive thief. Hank, the loud DEA agent. Tuco, the drug-addled lunatic. Gus, the corporate psychopath. And suddenly, Skyler. Skyler, who nags, doubts, and draws lines, is public enemy number one. There is a lot of irony. Walter is a real-life drug lord who poisons kids, hires people to kill them, and controls everyone around him. But Skyler gives him a handjob while she looks at her laptop, and all of a sudden, she's unforgivable? The audience feels sorry for Walter, not because he deserves it, but because the story was made to give it to him, until it couldn't deny that he had become a monster. But even at the end, some people cheered him on as he set Jack and his friends on fire, saved Jesse, and got his family a final payday. As if killing the devil somehow gives him back his soul. People hated Skyler for doing what most people would do. Yes, but not perfectly, but in a fair way. And it seems that some people think that is worse than mass murder. People who don't like being reminded that Walter White wasn't a hero. He was a bad guy who brought everyone else down with him. So who do people hate the most? Skyler White is the most hated character by a long shot, if we don't take narrative logic into account. But what if we are judging by who deserves it? That's a race between Uncle Jack, Todd, and anyone else whose crimes don't include a wedding ring and a joint checking account. Don't kid yourself. Walter White never felt guilty. Not about Jane. Not about the crash. Not even about a child. One might think that a man who was indirectly responsible for a terrible mid-air collision, and by extension, the suicide of an air traffic controller, would have a hard time dealing with the consequences. But Walter White has never been one to act like a decent person. The main character of the show never talks about Jane Margolis's death, her father Donald's collapse, or the terrible things that happened as a result. But the silence is so loud. Walter, of course, knew exactly what he had done. He stood by and watched Jane die, figuring that Jesse would be easier to control without her. He ran into Donald Margolis at a bar just hours before the planes crashed. This meeting should have made Walter feel some guilt or recognition, but, as is usual for him, he doesn't feel guilty. It's hard to say for sure if Walter felt guilty about the crash or Donald's suicide later on. He acts like the whole thing doesn't matter, just like he did after Drew Sharp's murder. He has a brief moment of feeling bad, but then he quickly rationalizes it away. When Jesse and Mike are really upset about Drew's death and even yell at Todd, Walter just goes back to work, whistling happily as he does so. Nothing says mental torture like a happy song after a child is killed. The closest Walter comes to an emotional reckoning is his bizarre meltdown at the school assembly following the plane crash. There, he tries to turn tragedy into something that is statistically unavoidable, filling his speech with forced optimism and irrelevant facts, as if moral absolution could be found in actuarial tables. It's not guilt. It's just PR for his own ego. His obsession with newspaper articles about the crash doesn't show that he's sad. It shows that he's still looking for a story where he's not to blame. When he talks about the crash with Jesse later, he doesn't want to confess. He wants to explain why it happened. If Walter rationalized his part in the collision with such flair, there's no reason to believe he approached Donald Margolis' suicide with any more honesty. Walter White doesn't feel bad about what he did. He feels like it's a hassle. Tragedy is either a tool for control or a footnote in the story of his grand ascension. And if a few lives, or dozens, are lost along the way, well, that's just too bad. But ultimately, it's in the past. Gus Fring never wanted to hire Walter White. He was preparing to bury him. Let's dispense with the myth of Gus Fring as some benevolent, opportunity-offering entrepreneur who merely hoped Walter White would one day see the light and return to the super lab with gratitude in his heart. Walter quits in the first episode of Season 3 of Breaking Bad. That's it. And Gus, who is known for being calculating, calm, and not very forgiving of debts, is suddenly supposed to shrug and say, well, maybe he'll come around eventually. Not at all. At this point, Walter is more than just a freelance meth cook with different ideas. He is an outsider who isn't committed to Gus, but knows way too much about his business, like where the lab is and who works there. And yes, he has a brother-in-law who works for the DEA. But yes, let's believe Gus was going to let that go out the door without supervision, payment, or death. Gus Fring is the same person who runs his empire with the cold efficiency of a Fortune 500 CEO and a cartel killer. He doesn't really like to leave things hanging. Gus wouldn't have had to do anything drastic if Walter hadn't shown signs of being willing to work with him. The Salamanca twins were already eager to do the dirty work for him because they were so angry about their cousin's death. Gus just had to get out of the way and let nature, or more accurately, narcos, do what they do. And then there's Jesse Pinkman, the unknown factor in this equation. Gus knew exactly what he was. A drug-addled, unstable person who couldn't be trusted with trade secrets, let alone making meth on a large scale. If Walt stayed stubborn, Jesse would have been the first to go. He was easier to get rid of, less valuable, and not as important. Then Walt's refusal would go away in a cloud of plausible deniability. In the end, Gus's relationship with Walt was never about working together. It was about usefulness. Walter lived as long as he was useful. The arrangement would change at that moment. Gus didn't give people second chances. He got rid of things that weren't working. And Walter White was the worst of all, because he had no loyalty, contract, or leverage. You've been told lies about Breaking Bad. Walter White wasn't a genius. He was just lucky. Walter White's rise through the criminal underworld wasn't the work of a genius. It was a series of lucky breaks for a man who had no idea what he was doing. He became a meth empire kingpin despite having almost no street smarts. He didn't do it through hard work, cleverness, or criminal instinct. Instead, he rode a streak of unbelievable luck and relied heavily on his one and only skill, chemistry. Let's make it clear. Walter White was never a tough criminal. He was a sheltered, self-centered egotist who thought that his intelligence and a few dramatic monologues could help him get through the harsh world of cartel violence and criminal politics. Talking to Tuco was often his idea of strategy, and it almost got him killed, but it didn't change his mind about being a good criminal. He kept telling himself that he could out-Gus Gus Fring, even though he didn't have any of Gus's calmness, foresight, or strategic discipline. And for a short, crazy time, he did fill the power gap that was left. He teamed up with Lydia to start a business that operated around the world. Then, ironically, he retired because he felt guilty and Skyler pressured him to do so. He then ruined his whole life by leaving a murder confession in his bathroom. That was very smart of you. People who don't like Walt like to point out that he talked his way out of a lot of trouble. Like when he manipulated Jesse, staged a fake fugue state, used his cancer to get sympathy, and even framed Hank. Yes, manipulation worked sometimes, but only when luck was on their side. But let's not mix up being good at something with being able to improvise. He often won because other people were incompetent or emotionally weak, not because he was a genius. This persistent myth that Walt is a criminal genius falls apart when you put him next to someone like Lalo Salamanca. It's funny to think that Walt could last 5 minutes against Lalo.
Lalo had Mike's instincts and a Bond villain's style. Walt wouldn't be able to last an episode. If the writers gave him divine plot intervention, he might last a season. But if logic won out, he wouldn't last a moment longer. The truth is that Walt's best ideas, like blowing up Tuco's office, putting an M60 in the trunk, and planning Gus's death with a wheelchair bell bomb, were not brilliant, but rather flashes of creativity brought on by desperation. Yes, they were smart, but they were also careless, situational, and completely unsustainable in a world that needs discipline and consistency. Gus would never have put Gail's notebook on the back of a toilet. Lalo wouldn't have needed luck to beat Jack's crew. He would have taken them apart piece by piece with a smile. The endless buzzwords, narcissist, manipulative, egotistical, aren't just lazy insults. They are correct, and they are important for understanding why Walter White's story is a tragedy of delusion and not a triumph of intelligence. He wanted people to be afraid of him, respect him, and remember him, not because of what he did, but because he thought he deserved it. And in the end, his own arrogance and a string of dumb mistakes brought him down. Yes, Walter White did get lucky, over and over again. But being lucky isn't the same as being great, and staying alive is not the same as being the best. Hank Schrader wasn't the hero. He just had better PR than Heisenberg. By the time Breaking Bad reaches its 5th season, Hank Schrader's moral compass has stopped spinning. It's just broken in half. The once good cop who was obsessed with catching the infamous Heisenberg has turned into someone much less moral and much more desperate. This is most clear in Rabid Dog, where his treatment of Jesse Pinkman isn't just bad, it's also revealing. Let's not act like Hank thought Jesse was anything other than disposable. When he wires Jesse up and pushes him to fight Walt, it's clear what he wants. Bait on a hook, pulled behind a boat full of sharks. The kid is alive? Great. The child dies? Still useful, and maybe even better. Hank's own words to Gomez say it all. The junkie murderer dribbling all over my guest bathroom floor. How nice. It's hard to think of a clearer sign that Jesse's fate was less important than how clean Hank's tile grout was. Did Hank want Jesse to die? Not quite. But did you care if he lived? No way. The goal of the crusade to kill Heisenberg was worth Jesse's death. The idea that Hank was counting on Walt's fatherly instincts to keep Jesse safe doesn't make him any less guilty. It just shows that he was betting on a person's life based on emotional manipulation, not strategy. He was counting on Walt's moral flaws while ignoring his own. And just to be clear, Jesse wasn't a bad guy at this point. He was a young man who was broken and sorry and wanted to make things right. Hank still used him like a chew toy, though. Hank's reaction was to turn Jesse into a weapon, even though Jesse could be a key witness and confronting Walt was very dangerous. A real moral support. Even Gomez, who is always the voice of reason, raised an eyebrow at the carelessness. But at that point, Hank wasn't paying attention. He wasn't looking for justice, he was looking for a trophy. Walt's downfall was now personal, and Jesse's health was no longer important. Hank didn't need Jesse to be alive, he just needed him to be useful. And it seems that usefulness ends as soon as the tape stops playing. It's not hard to say that Hank was walking a fine line in his quest for justice. But this wasn't the noble pursuit of law enforcement. It was just tunnel vision pretending to be duty. Isn't it funny? Hank always thought of himself as the only person who wasn't corrupt because of Walt. But in the end, it was Hank who put lives at risk, broke the rules, and put the weak in danger, all to bring down a monster he was becoming more and more like. The goal may have been justice, but revenge was the way. And Jesse Pinkman was just another acceptable loss along the way. Subscribe for more.